Knowledge media.
Knowledge as process.
Knowledge is something human beings naturally crave.
Do you know what it means to know something?
The Knowledge Media Podcast with Heather Prozac.
Joining us today, Mark Groves, creator of Create the Love. Now, I've been following, Mark, your Instagram account for 3 or 4 years. You have over 1 million people watching. And I was always like, man, that guy's got it on point. He's awesome. and then we got into the pandemic, I started noticing that your conversations didn't change from relationships, but there became a little bit more of a different perspective shifting. And then I started following your other account, Mark Groves. And I'm like, oh, wow, you have totally stepped up. And I want to say thank you for sharing your perspective, because a lot of people are scared to. Like, I look at my DMs. People don't want to speak up about how much they've been hurt over the past, how they've been hurt. But you've been a great voice. So thank you.
Oh, well, thanks so much. You know, when you're in the midst of trying to decide if you're going to speak up about something that goes against what is seemingly consensus, it's like you're going against so much human conditioning that says, Gabor Mate talks about how we have two needs as humans. We have the need to belong, and we have the need to self-express. And when self-expression threatens belonging usually wins. So, and what that really means is, if you being you threatens the status of any of your relationship and group membership, you most often will not be you. And so this is how we have evolved to relate. And a lot of what I witnessed, I never thought I'd be talking about any of this. I was a pharmaceutical rep for 14 years. So
I had no idea, really.
Yeah. So I actually never thought that world, I thought I was karmically undoing that part of my world, which really prepared me in a lot of ways for all the work that I've done. Because, I did sales and I studied human behavior in that perspective. And then I had a relationship end and started to study romantic relationships, went back to school, studied positive psychology, and really immersed myself in that space of understanding communication and human connection. And I never thought that those worlds would collide. And it was when I started to see the weight of what I was seeing, where normally, historically, if you and I were prescribed any medication, we would, Google it, learn about it. I have a background in at least understanding clinical trials, and I used to criticize them and sell against, so I knew how to pick apart clinical trials. And I was making assessments for myself, like, is this going to be a good fit for me? Do I want to get this intervention? How scary is this? And I kept seeing just these orange flags. And what really started to scare me was that the conversation about, is this a good fit or not, was being shamed. You could no longer actually explore. Like, if you were or I were prescribed an antihypertensive, we could go learn about it, and we'd say to our friend, I learned about this thing and I'm not sure I'm going to take it. And our friend would say, oh my God, that's great that you did the research. And now, anything that goes against, not even against, just actually poses a question, is shamed. And
which is incredible, because like you said, you used to be applauded for, wow, you researched that. Way to go. Thanks for the information, just anything like that. So is that where it started for you? Do you remember who you were talking to where that first shaming moment happened? Or did it gradually happen over time?
I was seeing it online. It was when they very early on made this massive recommendation. First off, I was reading the trials and I'm like, okay, relative risk reduction. They're not being transparent about how they're presenting the data. They didn't study if it reduces transmission. Why would they not study that? I know that companies pick endpoints in trials that they know they can win, because then what happens is the company uses the trial to apply for approval, and the approval is given, they get an indication, which means they can be used and say that they can do something. So if you can't prevent transmission, you legally, technically can't actually say it prevents transmission. And, there's obviously a lot more detail to that. So that was the first, was when they had recommended very early on that pregnant women could take it. And I just went on my Instagram stories and I'm like, look, I don't care what you choose. And I don't understand how there can be a recommendation for something in the absence of data.
Mm.
And oh man, did I face a barrage, and you're putting people at risk. And then I'd, post a picture in a story where I was out walking and it'd be like, you're not wearing a mask. Don't you know there's a pen? And I'm like, wow, they're so afraid
Yeah.
that even my behavior, although it's not increasing risk for them on a literal level,
Right.
it's the fear of death, that's being weaponized against them. And if I look back at the last couple of years, I'm like, wow, very few people would have been able to resist the large fear-based psychological operation. And I don't mean like organized. I have no idea if it's an organized
Totally.
psychological
Yes.
operation,
Yeah.
but I just mean the weaponization of fear. And anyone who's studied propaganda, I mean, you can, it's a
It's there.
propaganda
It's
is
history. Yeah.
marketing. Marketing is
Yes.
propaganda. So,
Yes.
and it was starting to see that the media was not criticizing anything, as where my perspective was that the job of the media
Hmm.
is to hold the government accountable, as well as pharmaceutical companies. And now I was starting to see that they were shaming, outing, doxing anybody who had any voice of opposition. And I thought, well, what the hell? Like, pharma companies used to be one of the least trusted companies out there in, when they did surveys. And now Moderna and Pfizer are two of the most trusted, which is ironic.
Very ironic. I find it interesting that, you talk about the propaganda, and a lot of people think that there's this big plan and every media person is in the plan. And there's like meetings, and it's like, that's not how it goes. But from my perspective, being in media for 20 years, what was saddest for me are some of the people I knew so well jumping on board. And I would call it dehumanizing individuals
Yeah,
that
it
they
is.
may not know, just to jump on that storyline that you just finished talking about, how you got attacked. And I never felt good about it. No matter as early as this started, I thought that is not the way to be right now. And so when we transition with what you did with Create the Love, which is, again, if you don't follow it, follow it, but you really studied human behavior, relationships. So, one of the things that I've had a lot of people commenting to me about is a lot of them married, and some of them saying, we were on such opposite ends of this thing at the beginning of the pandemic. I thought I was going to divorce him, or I thought I was going to divorce her. Luckily,
Yeah.
the friends I have, they didn't. Um, what have you learned about human behavior, and how has it shifted your perspective after going through the last 2 years in watching relationships and understanding them?
Well, I think what this has presented, it magnified difference that already existed, like in couples that
Yeah.
weren't doing well, that weren't dealing with their stuff, who weren't at home, maybe escaping their conflict by being at work or being busy. Lockdowns, and lockdowns are a whole other can of worms,
But
because
can we just focus on what you just said? Because I think
yeah.
that, like, we need to give that a lot of light, because I always felt that might have been it. But is that what you found was the number one? If there was already differences there, it just magnified it.
Yeah, yeah, it was that compounded with the fact that one thing that was done by media and politicians and public health was there was a moralization of the choice. So you could see it in the language that they were using, which is on purpose. Don't doubt that the words that Justin Trudeau chose, or the words that public health officials chose, were not 100% on purpose. Every single word was selectively studied and used to infer they did the right thing, they made the right choice, they had each other's backs. As soon as you do that, and you saw this narrative occur that if you didn't do it, people called you selfish, and so right thing infers there's a wrong thing then. And
Mm,
inherently humans does, especially Canadians, we believe that we're good people, and that's a good thing. That self-identity is important, because then your behaviors will generally align with what you present in terms of your values. But what I started to see was that there was this weaponization of belonging, and for couples, what ended up happening, but I'd say this is true of friendships and parents and kids and colleagues, is that there was a righteousness to one choice and
Mm.
the villainization of another. And I interviewed Jay Bhattacharya, who's a professor of medicine from Stanford in public health. And, I heard, I think, is it Julie Ponesse?
Oh,
Ponesse?
Dr. Julie Ponesse. Yes. Yeah. I had her on the
Yeah,
show too. Yeah.
she's incredible. I heard her
Yeah, she
say
is.
that no longer are credentials determined by actual credentials, like you went to Stanford or Harvard. They're determined by agreement with the narrative. And that nailed it to me, because Jay Bhattacharya here is someone who's been in this world for 20, I think something like 20 years. And he said to me, it is a failure of public health to moralize it. And what I started to witness was the attempt to put shame on me for my hesitancy. And I thought, wow, like, it is so natural for a product to come out for anything that presents. And, where there is risk, there should be choice. But
Hmm.
wherever there's risk, it is normal to be hesitant. And it was almost like people were righteously saying, I did it for the greater good. I did it and I'm doing the right thing. And why are you even hesitant? And it was dismissing what every person would have been experiencing if they allowed themselves to this healthy level of skepticism. Even if you chose to get it, they're on an unconscious level. I guarantee there was at least some level of skepticism that was then shamed. And God, that for couples, I think, because I witnessed that in a few friends where one was pro and the other one wasn't.
Right.
And, they navigated it beautifully. It deepened their awareness of one another. But it's because if one person associates a value system with one choice, then the other person not making that choice now doesn't align with the value system. But what's really crazy, and what I've learned a lot in the last couple of years especially, is that everyone is actually orienting around very similar value systems. They're just orienting differently. And one says this is the right way. And
Hmm.
don't get me wrong, the other one still says this is the right way too, right? There's this idea that if you're pro or the anti, but even those labels themselves remove the very important gray and spectrum. And, everyone's operating from love ultimately, which is kind of crazy to think about, because I'm sure people haven't felt that way.
It's true. Wow. That's a great point. So how I can give you an example of where this question is coming from. Yesterday, I reached out to an old friend. So we'd been friends for a few years, and I thought I'll extend the olive branch. I went to Ottawa. I recorded a video. It went viral. I got fired. Okay, I'm doing the Cole's notes here, and he was one of the last people to text me. Um, he was angry I was there, and I can't actually remember the text that he had last sent me. And so I thought I would extend an olive branch, not I extended it just to be I thought there's no way that we're not going to be friends after this. I've given it some time. I'm going
Right.
to reach out. And the response was, I need more time to thoughtfully respond to you. And as I appreciated that, I thought, no, I don't need you to thoughtfully respond. We just need to have a conversation or just agree to disagree. Because that's what
Right.
through my friendship with him, there are things that I didn't agree with him on. Uh, I never needed to challenge him on it though, because I felt like our friendship was in a different category, right? Just
Hmm.
based on being a human being, going out for a coffee. So I extended the olive branch. It's there. That was his response. I don't know what the future will hold, but for those people that have the broken relationships and the broken friendships, what do you think, Mark, is the best way to go about if they feel like trying to repair? Like, how do you go about that? Is it that
I mean,
simple?
first, I want to acknowledge everyone who's in that, because there's a state of experience of I'm not loved for my choice, whatever that choice is, right? It could be anything, and it could be getting it, it could be not getting it. That's, again, it's like there's opposition on both ends. You know, in the last 10 years, especially, but I'd say the last couple years, we've really seen a magnified version of this polarity that exists. There's this. We all need to explore the gray that lives beyond our own beliefs and identity. You know, I found that when people would just because I was questioning things, I would automatically get called right wing or
Yeah.
anti. And I was like, wow, like none of those labels actually apply to me. And I'm not, but I understood. I had to explore it. Don't get me wrong. At first, I was angry because I felt like people weren't taking the time, who I loved, taking the time to understand my perspective, but even validate that I had the right to my perspective. I think what was going on, though, is that in the potential validation or witnessing of my perspective was then the gray in their own. You
Hmm.
know, so when our own identities and beliefs actually, if those become enmeshed, which I mean is if they become not different, like if your beliefs become your identity, which we see this in religion, it's an easy example, and you'll automatically dismiss information that makes your belief potentially wrong. And you'll especially dismiss it and double down on it if it threatens your identity. So
Wow.
if you get this intervention or don't, but that creates this identity that you are a good person or conscious or awake or whatever it is, then now your identity is attached to this having to be true.
Hmm.
And so I had to develop a lot of compassion for that, but in doing that, have more flexibility in my own thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. You know, I started to ask more questions to people who were more defensive of my perspective. And I really started to see that they were there because of fear, or they were there because they'd been consuming the news. They'd been there because they trusted their public health officials, which who shouldn't, right?
Who
Like
shouldn't?
that's
Absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
Who shouldn't trust their news? But you know, I have a buddy from China who I was telling, you know, like, man, the news is really not telling the truth. And he's like, I forget that you guys think the news is real, because you know, in his experience, he's never
Yeah.
believed it.
Totally.
So the way through is really having more compassion and flexibility in our own perspectives, because what happens then is I'm able to be compassionately curious to the other person. With the
Mm.
example like you're giving about this person that you're in a friendship with, or were in a friendship with, and you know, he's chosen to take some time to consider an appropriate response. You know, the convoy was fascinating because I knew so many people who went to it, and I knew so many people who were opposed to it.
Mhm.
And every single person I know who went was not a white supremacist. So like I can
Thanks for
guarantee that
saying that. I
I'm a
appreciate that.
I'm 100% sure of that. A lot of them were people of color, and a lot of them were in healthcare actually. As a rep, I just knew a lot of people who were in that. And what I found interesting about other people's experience, if I said something about it, was that like it's a white supremacy, and how can you support that? That harms people of color. And I said, you know, I hear you, and 99.9999% of the people there are not even anti-vax, they're just anti-mandate, and they're not racist. And I said, so, you know, and in talking to this person who really gave me that feedback, she was saying to me, yeah, I think it's important that you denounce that and support it. Like, I think you can do both. And I was like, that's totally fair. I
Yeah.
understand that. It was that the media did such a big job of, again, making this about values. Do you
Yeah.
see, like, ultimately that's what's occurred. Like Justin Trudeau, when he called people who questioned vaccination, he called them misogynist, racist, and anti-science. He chose those words for very good reasons, because what he's done is he's done unconsciously. He's made it so we associate this one group with these other groups that we would never tolerate. And he even finished it with, do we tolerate these people? In Brene Brown's work studying dehumanization, she talks about how dehumanization, if you look at history, always begins with language. It begins with othering. And as soon as I heard him say that, I was like, what's he planning?
Mhm.
And then the travel mandates. So, you know, that, because what it does is it makes a general person who identifies as pro or has made the choice that goes along with the appropriate consensus, uh, now they're going to support this thing because these people are a threat, and they actually are possibly misogynist and racist. So unconsciously, people have been totally manipulated. And, you know, I'm really curious to learn more about what psychological tricks were used by the Department of Defense and Public Health
Me too.
in order to do that, because it was certainly a planned execution. You also saw him Trudeau do a complete pivot
Hmm.
in his messaging right before the new election. So you know that he did polls and he went on a limb that he might get a majority government if he went with this very aggressive campaign. And because he went from Canada as a place that would never do that to Canada as a place that only takes care of each other and would never not do that. So
Yeah.
it's very confusing to people. If
Hmm.
you're confused, then you're paying attention. If it doesn't make sense, then you're paying attention.
Right.
And that's the part that's actually total fuckery to the
Yeah.
mind.
Totally. So,
That was a
we
long
go.
answer. Sorry.
No, well, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it either. It was just a fascinating moment I had yesterday. I knew we were talking today, and I thought, man, this is like
You
perfect
let them
timing.
go. You tell them you love them and
Yeah,
you love them no
that's
matter
what I
what.
did.
What
Yeah,
I say to people who have an opposing view is, I love you no matter what you choose. I
yeah.
always will. And I'm always a space that you can come back to. And I respect your decision, although it hurts, you
It's like a
know?
betrayal, right? But at the same time, you know, when you're going through a situation like this, and so many people are in different ways, like there are some people I know that their families have separated because of this. There's a lot
It's
of healing that
ridiculous.
needs to. It
It
is
the fact that
to
families are
us.
divided, yeah, well, the
Mhm.
fact that families are divided based on politics and medical choices is just shows you the level of psychological
Yeah,
manipulation that has occurred. Whether someone's right or left, it's because we've associated values with those. And I'm more liberal leaning, always have been, although I
mhm,
don't align anymore with the way that the left represents itself. The left represents itself as good, as everything it does is good. And if you look, the media is also canceling any dissent. And so whenever you cancel any dissent, you give the illusion of consensus. So, any physician or media person who spoke out is gone. Like you, Kid Carson, gone. Like any doctors who have spoken out, medical licenses taken away. They can't write exemptions, like they're being shunned and shamed by their community, their livelihoods and their identities. All these people are under threat. How? I mean, it takes so much courage to stand up against the possibility of exile and not belonging. I mean, that's why I have so much admiration and respect for people like yourself who have said, because listen, there's lots of people with incredible integrity who didn't have the strength because they had so many things pushed against them. Like you can't
totally.
keep your
Yes, there's
job, they got to pay
yes.
their rent. There's nothing wrong with succumbing to those things.
No.
What we should be angry about is, how is that allowed? That's a
Mhm.
100% violation of the definition of informed consent. If
Yeah.
you would not get the intervention if there was not a consequence, if your answer is you wouldn't have got it, then you were coerced. And people don't want to acknowledge that I mean, we are trampling all over history and what we've learned. And I mean, ideally, this will wake people up, because clearly anytime anything exists explicitly, it's existed implicitly. And I think the systems of lobbying and pharma and all the different companies and profit and business are, the marriage between all those things is so explicitly obvious now that, we have no choice but to stand up against it.
I think that this is going to go down in history like 20, 30, 40, maybe when we're 90. Let's be honest, when we're
Yeah,
90, 100. It is going to be interesting for students to be walked through this timeline. And I have no idea if it's
100%.
going to be a social media aspect. Maybe it's like the propaganda, the media. I don't even know. It's going to be like, and here's 2020 to 2022, right? Like this is the big book to go and study off of. It's going to be insane, and it'll be interesting to see how they take it. But uh, is there anything that you've been working on, or anyone that you have come in contact with, that I always kind of like to throw it back to my guests, as far as something that is meaningful in their lives right now that they're going through that they want others to know about because it's significant?
Huh. Well, I feel like I'm going through a large identity shift. I feel like I've never had, so it's definitely certainly a privilege because I've never had my home or the country I'm from feel like it doesn't welcome me and
Wow.
isn't safe psychologically. Like, if you have not received this medical intervention, you are psychologically not safe in your country. You're also physically, technically not safe too. And if you look at the study of corporate culture, the study of relationships, the number one core thing is, are you safe to be yourself? And that's gone. I never would have guessed that that would be true. And what's interesting about that is, even if you've made the choice that makes it so you are theoretically still safe, you actually will unconsciously recognize you're not, because the moment you make a choice that goes against, and this is what humans do, we bring in way more information than we process consciously. So even if I'm making the choice that's viable and I don't get my bank account frozen and all, whatever it might be, what has happened in Canada now is a large psychological trauma. And what I'm working on is, how do you maintain safety and home in yourself when you don't feel that in the place you're from? And I'm sure there's lots of immigrants who would offer a lot of insight and wisdom
I was listening
on
to a
that.
lot of people who had immigrated to Canada. A lot of them had, you want to,
Right.
don't go too far from someone who's speaking up. There was a gentleman, he was 65 years old. He was actually in Ottawa, and I was listening to him talk, and he was talking to me about why he left China. And he said, this is hard for people to hear, but he said the examples are very similar to what's going on in China and what happened at the beginning. He goes, I was a child when I watched it come in. And I'm like, why aren't people listening to these people, the ones that have left their countries for a better life?
Yeah, I think because it causes so much dissonance. It's like
Mm,
when people compare, but that dissonance is so important. You have to be able to learn to sit in dissonance, because what it's saying is that there's something incongruent with your beliefs of how the world works and how the world is working. This is true of how we are relationally. This is true in general of our lives. Like, if you're making a choice or you're being told something, but it's not matching what is actually being experienced, it's kind of like I, at the very beginning, was saying, when you go into a restaurant and you got to wear a mask on your face, and then when you sit down, you take it off, people go, well, just wear them to keep restaurants open. And I'm like, yeah, I totally get that. I have so many friends who work at
yeah,
restaurants, who
totally.
own restaurants.
Yeah.
I said, but it's not, it's such, it seems like a little thing, but it's not, because it doesn't make any sense. And what it prepares you for cognitively is that you're going to now start to filter out things that don't make sense, because you've been primed for that. And when we compare, or someone says, well, it's a lot like what people were like in Nazi Germany or in China or North Korea, the first reaction is very much like, never compare it to that, because it's disrespectful. And I totally understand that, and I can appreciate where that's coming from. The reason we study history is so we don't repeat it. And what I
Hmm.
believe people are really trying to say is, we've seen patterns like this before, and this is where it has gone. So we're actually respecting the memory and history of the thing, so that we can say we're drawing upon this atrocity to say, hey, this could happen. I would imagine everyone who's ever been in those circumstances, although I can't say this is true, but I would imagine, never thought it would get to where it gets. And look, I never voted in the previous federal election, so I can't say I voted for Justin Trudeau, but I probably would have. And I now listen to him and I'm like, the guy doesn't answer any questions. No one answers any questions.
None.
And he talks about admiring the basic dictatorship of China. I mean, I you don't even have to study psychological disorders to just have an awareness that he's gaslights plenty. He seems to be uh, somewhat narcissistic. I mean, if it frustrates people to hear what we're saying, good,
Yeah.
because it should.
Um, and you actually were on Sarah Swain's podcast, which, and she was on yours. I love her. I had a
I
chance to
love
sit down
Sarah.
and
Yeah.
but what I love about her is the political mindset, because I'm like you. I've always voted, but I've never been a politically charged person. And I'm still not a politically charged person, but I am a person now who's taken keen interest in following the House of Commons and what's going on there day to
Same.
day, which I never did before.
Same.
And yeah, so to just give Sarah credit and yourself, you have these very large accounts, but you guys are using them to inform people. So I just want to say thank you for that. Sarah is a great person if you are confused about the political system. She has a way to educate it, because isn't
She's
that
so
what
good.
it isn't she? But what I find is, like, we are all confused. Like, we're confused about how it works, the processes, and then we're like, well, the government will handle it. And then here we are with a lot
Oh,
more questions than answers.
man. I'm so guilty of what you're saying. Like, I said this on Sarah's podcast because it actually creates a lot of sadness in me about myself, which is
Me too. Yeah.
I thought I thought a democracy would take care of itself.
Me
Oh
too.
man, that's so ignorant. Like
I
even saying
know.
that, I just want to punch younger version of myself to say like this is where we get to when we're not active in our political spaces, which doesn't mean you have to become a politician, but
No.
like to everyone who's silenced their voice, what it does when you silence your voice to be agreeable and to
Mhm.
maintain belonging is you actually end up in a world you don't agree with. And it will actually be your fault.
Yeah.
And I say that to others as I say it to myself. Any relationship that is based on the requirement of my silence, I don't want.
Hmm.
And that includes people on social media. That includes if you don't like what I say, that's okay. Our job is not to agree. I was listening to Jonathan Haidt recently. There's someone who has been inspiring me a lot.
Okay.
Um, and he has a book called Coddling of the American Mind, which is fantastic, and everybody needs to read it because it will tell you exactly how we got where we are. But one of the things he said in a recent podcast that I listened to of his, he said, I think he was quoting his rabbi. He said that when we move beyond the binary, we end up with a third perspective, and it is seemingly wiser than the first two.
Hmm.
And essentially, his message is that when we cancel dissent of any kind, everyone actually ends up more stupid. And that is the work that I've been doing is how do I be a bridge? How
Right.
do I take like how badly I want to identify a certain way so I could be part of a group and part of this or part of I'm like, fuck all the identities. I don't want any of that. It's like I don't want labels. And when we start to label people, we have to be really mindful because we become the type of person who labels people,
Hmm.
and so we dehumanize others when we put them in boxes.
Yeah, it goes both ways, right? I'm glad
100%.
you said that. I think that I always like the idea of hope, and I don't think hope is lost. When
No,
the
neither do I.
latest story about the domestic travel and what the government has done with that, and opening it up to people that didn't get it. Um, I had a lot of DMs saying, "Oh, well, there's a bit of jadedness," and I understand why. There's a lack of trust, but I think what we need to do is get more informed, get more involved. Doesn't mean, like you said, you have to get politically charged where that's all you stand for, but just understand how it works, how the process works, who you email if you have to, and email, like
Hold
actually
your
email.
MPs accountable. Email
Hmm.
Omar Amal or whatever his last name is. He
Yeah. Yeah.
I also am really mindful of when I'm getting enraged by a politician or a person because I'm giving away my peace. And
Yes.
I've been very mindful of that. Like, it's not them that we're angry at, it's what they represent. And that could be the fuel to our transformation. And,
Mm.
ultimately, that's how worlds change. You open your heart, you learn how to be more compassionate. You don't exile other people because of their beliefs, because you're doing exactly what that's why I can't stand when people call people sheep. It
Oh, I
is
hate that too.
it's the worst. It's the worst.
Yes,
It's
it is.
so dehumanizing. It's the exact same thing,
Hmm.
And so we have to do a really broad job of acknowledging our anger, but actually increasing our level of compassion and awareness.
And stepping up, and that the government works for us. We're to let them know what's
Right.
going on.
Isn't that
And there
messed
was
up?
Yeah, it is. Mark, it has been a pleasure. Like, incredible.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And it's such an honor and seriously, like the courageous path you've walked has been
Mm.
inspiring. And, I saw the video when it went viral before I ever
Oh,
met you or got in contact with you. And, that I know you probably thought you were just going to explore something. You never thought it would cost you your job.
yes. No.
And that shows you the kind of world that we're in right now, and we can fight for a different one. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you. And what's the best way that people can follow you? What for the latest updates and what you're doing? Because I think it's really important that if you are not following him, do so.
Yeah, thanks. So for my more romantic relational work or family, all that kind of stuff, I Create the Love on Instagram, and then it's Mark Groves on Instagram, where I talk more about the political sort of pharma side of things and the science. I share a lot of studies that I see and read and find, and I have a podcast called the Mark Groves Podcast. So that's where you can find basically everything.
Everything. Thanks for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.